Ladies and gentlemen, AG Archivist here. And before we begin, the standard disclaimer that my compliance team insists upon: nothing in this video constitutes financial advice. I am not a licensed financial advisor. I am a person who spends an uncomfortable amount of time reading communiques from summits in cities most Americans cannot pronounce, tracking the geopolitical chess moves that will determine the financial architecture of the next century. Please consult a qualified professional before making any investment decisions. My opinions are exactly that, opinions, and the future remains stubbornly resistant to prediction. Now, let us discuss why I believe the most significant story in global finance is not on the front page of any Western newspaper. If you want to understand why the dollar's reserve currency status is under genuine threat for the first time since 1944, you need to stop watching the Federal Reserve press conferences. You need to stop obsessing over inflation prints and employment data. You need to stop listening to Treasury officials who assure you that the dollar's dominance is unshakable. Instead, you need to look at a map. Specifically, you need to look at a map of the nations that have just joined BRICS, those applying to join, and those quietly aligning themselves with this emerging bloc without formal membership. Because while American financial media remains fixated on whether the Fed will cut rates by 25 or 50 basis points, a parallel financial system is being constructed in plain sight. And this parallel system is specifically designed to operate without the US dollar, without the SWIFT messaging network, without the Western-controlled institutions that have governed international finance for 80 years. This is the Bretton Woods bypass. It is the most ambitious challenge to American financial hegemony since the dollar replaced the pound sterling. And based on the latest BRICS expansion, in my view, it is accelerating faster than Washington anticipated. Today, we are going to conduct a forensic deep dive into who just joined BRICS, what strategic assets they bring to the table, and why I believe these additions transform BRICS from an acronym into an architecture. We are going to trace the dollar outflows that are already occurring, the bilateral trade agreements that bypass the dollar entirely, and the emerging payment systems that could, in my opinion, render SWIFT optional within a decade. Washington is worried. They should be. Let us establish precisely what happened. At the most recent BRICS summit, the bloc formally extended invitations for membership to a new cohort of nations. The additions include Indonesia, the world's fourth most populous country, and Southeast Asia's largest economy. Partners like Turkey, a NATO member that is increasingly pivoting eastward. They include Algeria, Nigeria, and other African nations with significant natural resources. They include additional Middle Eastern states that control critical energy infrastructure. The original BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has now become BRICS Plus, with a membership roster that, depending on how you count associate members and partners, represents approximately 45% of the world's population and over 35% of global GDP, measured by purchasing power parity. Let me emphasize that GDP figure. BRICS Plus nations now produce more economic output than the G7, the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. This is not a future projection. This is the current reality, but the raw economic numbers do not capture the strategic significance. The significance lies in what these specific nations control. Control. Point 1, energy. BRICS Plus now includes Russia, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, and other major energy exporters. Combined, these nations control approximately 42% of global oil production and an even larger share of global natural gas production. They control the energy that powers the global economy. Control point 2, critical minerals. The new members bring control over lithium, cobalt, copper, rare earths, and other minerals essential for the green energy transition and advanced technology. Indonesia alone controls approximately 22% of global nickel production. The Democratic Republic of Congo, which has been heavily courted by the BRICS, controls 70% of global cobalt production. Control point 3, trade routes. Turkey controls the Bosphorus Strait. Egypt, a BRICS member, controls the Suez Canal. Iran influences the Strait of Hormuz. Indonesia controls the Strait of Malacca. BRICS Plus is assembling control over the choke points through which global trade flows. Control point 4, population and labor. BRICS Plus represents over 3.5 billion people. This is the labor force, the consumer market, and the human capital that will drive economic growth for the next century. The demographics favor BRICS. The G7 nations are aging and shrinking. BRICS nations are young and growing. This is the resource lockup. BRICS is not merely an economic alliance. It is a systematic aggregation of the physical resources that the global economy requires to function. And, by bringing these resources under a common framework, BRICS gains leverage that transcends traditional economic metrics. Why does BRICS expansion threaten the dollar? Let me explain the mechanism, because it is more subtle than most commentators acknowledge. The dollar's reserve currency status rests on a circular logic. Countries need dollars to buy oil and other commodities. Because they need dollars, they hold dollars in reserve. Because they hold dollars in reserve, they buy U.S. Treasury bonds. Because they buy U.S. Treasuries, the United States can run massive deficits without facing the consequences that would bankrupt any other nation. This is the exorbitant privilege that French finance ministers have complained about for decades. America prints money, the world absorbs it. America runs deficits, the world finances them. America imposes sanctions. The world complies because leaving the dollar system seemed impossible. BRICS is constructing the exit. Mechanism 1, bilateral trade settlement. BRICS nations are increasingly conducting trade with each other in local currencies rather than dollars. Russia and China settle trade in rubles and yuan. India and Russia settle trade in rupees and rubles. Saudi Arabia has publicly discussed accepting the yuan for oil sales to China. Each bilateral agreement is a small chip in the dollar's foundation. Individually, none of them threatens the system. Collectively, they are creating alternative pathways that could, over time, drain transaction volume from dollar markets. Mechanism 2, the BRICS currency basket. While a single BRICS currency remains aspirational, the bloc is actively developing a trade settlement currency basket, a unit of account backed by a weighted average of member nation currencies and, crucially, by commodities including gold and potentially other resources. This is not the same as a full currency. It is more limited, but it provides a mechanism for settling trade imbalances without the need for dollar intermediation. If Brazil owes India for imported goods, they can settle in the basket rather than both parties converting to dollars. Mechanism 3. Alternative payment infrastructure. BRICS nations are building payment systems that bypass SWIFT. Russia's SPFS, China's CIPS, and India's UPI are being integrated to enable cross-border payments without relying on Western infrastructure. The significance of this cannot be overstated. When the United States sanctioned Russia and froze $300 billion in central bank reserves, it demonstrated to every nation on earth that dollar-denominated assets held in Western institutions are not truly yours. They can be frozen, seized, or confiscated with a keystroke. Every BRICS nation watched that episode. Every BRICS nation drew the same conclusion. We need an alternative system that the United States cannot weaponize against us. This is the sanction proofing. BRICS is not just creating an alternative financial system for efficiency or ideology. It is creating a system specifically designed to be immune to American financial coercion. Let me now explain in more detail why these developments concern American policymakers. The concerns are not theoretical. They are based on concrete financial and strategic implications. Concern 1. Treasury demand destruction. The United States needs to issue approximately $2 trillion in new Treasury bonds every year to finance the federal deficit. Add refinancing of maturing debt, and total issuance needs exceed $9 trillion annually. Who buys this debt? Historically, a significant portion has been purchased by foreign central banks, particularly those running trade surpluses with the United States. China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, and other nations recycled their dollar earnings into treasury bonds. If BRICS nations stop accumulating dollars because they are trading in other currencies, they stop buying treasury bonds. If they stop buying treasury bonds, the United States must find other buyers. If other buyers cannot be found at current yields, yields must rise to attract buyers. If yields rise significantly, the interest cost on the national debt explodes, potentially triggering a fiscal crisis. This is not happening overnight, but the trajectory is clear. China has reduced its treasury holdings from $1.3 trillion to under $700 billion over the past decade. This is not portfolio rebalancing. This is strategic divestment. And every nation that joins BRICS is another potential treasury seller or, at a minimum, a lost future buyer. Concern 2, petrodollar erosion. The petrodollar system, the arrangement by which oil is priced and sold in dollars, has been the backbone of dollar hegemony since the 1970s. Every nation needs oil, therefore, every nation needs dollars. Therefore, the dollar is indispensable. BRICS is eroding the system from multiple angles. Saudi Arabia, the linchpin of the petrodollar, is now a BRICS member. Saudi officials have publicly discussed accepting yuan, rupees, and other currencies for oil sales. While the majority of Saudi oil is still sold in dollars, the mere willingness to discuss alternatives represents a tectonic shift. If oil can be purchased in yuan or a BRICS currency basket, the need to hold dollar reserves diminishes. If the need diminishes, so does the demand for treasuries. If treasury demand diminishes, America's ability to finance its deficits at low interest rates diminishes. Concern 3, sanctions evasion. American foreign policy has increasingly relied on financial sanctions as a tool of coercion. Sanctions work because exclusion from the dollar system is economically devastating. Being cut off from SWIFT means being cut off from international trade. But BRICS is building a sanctions-proof architecture. If you can trade in yuan and settle through CIAPs, American sanctions become advisory rather than mandatory. If you can buy oil from Russia or Iran in currencies outside Western control, the sanctions have no teeth. Every nation that joins BRICS gains access to this sanctions evasion infrastructure. Every nation, considering defying American policy, can calculate whether the BRICS alternative is sufficient to survive sanctions. As BRICS expands, the alternative becomes more robust, and the deterrent power of sanctions diminishes. Concern 4. Geopolitical realignment. This concern transcends economics. The BRICS expansion represents a fundamental realignment of the global order. Nations that were previously aligned with the West, or at least neutral, are choosing sides, and they are not choosing America. Turkey is a NATO member that is joining BRICS. Indonesia has been carefully cultivated by American policymakers as a democratic counterweight to China. Saudi Arabia has been a cornerstone of American Middle East policy for 7 decades. All of them are moving toward BRICS. Washington must confront an uncomfortable question. Why are these nations hedging their bets? Why are longtime allies seeking alternatives? The answer, in my view, is that American policy has become increasingly unreliable. Sanctions are weaponized unpredictably. Alliances are questioned by changing administrations. The rules-based order that America champions seems to apply only to others. BRICS offers an alternative where nations are not subject to American domestic politics. Whether this alternative is better or worse is debatable. That it is increasingly attractive is not the case. Is there historical precedent for a reserve currency transition? Indeed, there is, and the precedent is instructive. The pound-sterling transition. For over a century, the British pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. International trade was denominated in pounds. Central banks held pound reserves. London was the center of global finance. The transition from pound to dollar did not happen suddenly. It happened gradually, then suddenly. The erosion took decades. The collapse took years. The Suez Crisis of 1956 is often cited as the moment of transition. Britain attempted a military intervention in Egypt. The United States opposed it. The Eisenhower administration threatened to dump British treasury bonds and crash the pound unless Britain withdrew. Britain withdrew. The world saw that American financial power exceeded British imperial power. The pound's reserve status, already weakened by 2 world wars, never recovered. Within a decade, the dollar was unquestionably dominant. The lesson is this: reserve currency transitions are not linear. They proceed slowly, with gradual erosion of confidence and accumulation of alternatives, until a crisis moment accelerates the transition beyond the tipping point. In my view, we are in the gradual erosion phase. BRICS expansion is accumulating alternatives. Dollar confidence is eroding through sanctions weaponization and fiscal irresponsibility. The crisis moment that accelerates the transition has not yet occurred. But it will occur. History suggests that it always does. The question is not whether the dollar's dominance will be challenged, but when the challenge becomes undeniable. Perhaps the most significant aspect of BRICS financial architecture is the discussion of commodity backing for the proposed currency basket. This deserves careful analysis. The dollar is backed by nothing except the full faith and credit of the United States government. This means it is backed by the government's ability to tax its citizens and the Federal Reserve's willingness to print money to pay debts. In practice, the dollar is backed by confidence that can erode. BRICS is discussing a currency basket backed by commodities. The specific proposals are still evolving, but the concept includes weighting the basket by gold reserves, oil reserves, and other strategic resources held by member nations. Consider what this would mean. A BRICS currency unit backed by actual gold in actual vaults, backed by oil in actual reserves, backed by physical resources that have intrinsic value, regardless of any government's creditworthiness. This is the commodity standard return. It is not a full gold standard as existed before 1971. It is a partial commodity backing that provides an anchor of real value behind the currency unit. Would such a system work? The technical challenges are significant. How do you audit commodity reserves across multiple nations? How do you handle nations that deplete reserves? How do you value the commodity basket as commodity prices fluctuate? These are real problems, but they are engineering problems, not fundamental obstacles, and the political will to solve them appears to be present. In my view, even a partial commodity backing would make the BRICS currency basket more attractive than the dollar to nations concerned about American fiscal policy. The United States is running a $2 trillion deficit indefinitely. The Federal Reserve has demonstrated a willingness to monetize government debt. The purchasing power of the dollar is eroding year after year. A commodity-backed alternative, even an imperfect one, offers something the dollar does not, a constraint on debasement. If the BRICS are building a commodity-backed financial system, We would expect member nations to accumulate the commodities that would back it, and indeed, we see exactly that. Central bank gold purchases have exceeded 1,000 tons annually for 2 consecutive years, the highest levels in decades. The buyers are overwhelmingly BRICS nations and aspiring BRICS members. China has reported gold purchases for 18 consecutive months, adding hundreds of tons to official reserves. And these are only the reported purchases. Analysts estimate that actual Chinese gold accumulation, including purchases through state-owned enterprises and sovereign wealth funds, is significantly higher. Russia has accumulated over 2,300 tons of gold, making it the 5th largest holder globally. India has been steadily adding to its reserves. Turkey, now a BRICS member, has one of the highest gold accumulation rates per capita in the world. Meanwhile, Western central banks are largely standing pat. The United States claims to hold 8,100 tons, but has not allowed a full independent audit since the 1950s. European central banks have largely stable holdings. The gold is flowing from west to east. The metal that would back a new monetary system is being systematically accumulated by the nations that are building it. This is the accumulation signal. Central bank behavior reveals central bank expectations. And central bank behavior clearly indicates that BRICS nations expect gold to play a larger role in the future monetary system. Now we arrive at the investment implications. If my analysis is correct, what does BRICS expansion mean for gold and silver? I must emphasize that these are my opinions, not predictions or guarantees. In my view, BRICS expansion is structurally bullish for precious metals for several interconnected reasons. Reason 1, reserve demand. If BRICS nations are building a commodity-backed currency system, they need to accumulate commodities to back it. Gold is the primary monetary commodity. Central bank demand, already at record levels, could increase further as the system takes shape. Reason 2, dollarization flow. As nations reduce dollar holdings, they must hold something else. Some of those reserves will flow to gold, which has served as a reserve asset for millennia and carries no counterparty risk. Reason 3, inflation hedge. If the dollar's reserve status erodes, the United States loses its ability to export inflation to the rest of the world. Inflation that was previously absorbed globally would be concentrated domestically. In an inflationary environment, precious metals historically perform well. Reason 4, uncertainty premium. The transition period from one monetary system to another is inherently uncertain. Uncertainty drives demand for assets that have value regardless of which system prevails. Gold and silver qualify. I want to be clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying precious metals are guaranteed to rise. I'm not saying there will not be volatility. I'm not saying the transition will be smooth or predictable. What I am saying is that the BRICS expansion and the de-dollarization it represents create a structural bid for precious metals that did not exist a decade ago. This is a fundamental shift in the investment landscape that, in my opinion, favors holding real assets over paper claims on increasingly unstable fiat systems. When will these changes manifest in markets? This is the question I cannot answer with any confidence. Monetary system transitions are measured in years and decades, not months. The erosion of the pound's reserve status took decades before the Suez moment accelerated the collapse. The current dollar erosion could follow a similar timeline. On the other hand, events can accelerate unexpectedly. A major geopolitical crisis, a conflict over Taiwan, a Middle East war, a financial crisis that forces the Fed to monetize unprecedented debt levels could compress the timeline dramatically. In my view, the prudent approach is to position for the transition without trying to time it precisely. Build positions in assets that benefit from de-dollarization, precious metals, commodities, and possibly BRICS-aligned assets, and hold them with patience. The transition is coming. Whether it takes 5 years or 25 years, the direction is, in my opinion, clear. Positioning early means tolerating paper losses and opportunity costs if the timeline is longer than expected. Positioning late means missing the majority of the move. I know which risk I prefer to take. Given the BRICS expansion and its implications, here's my framework for thinking about positioning. Remember, this is not financial advice. These are frameworks for consideration, not recommendations for action. Protocol. Rule 1, Physical Precious Metals Foundation. In a world where currency systems are in flux, physical gold and silver held outside the banking system represent insurance against all outcomes. Whatever happens with BRICS, whatever happens with the dollar, physical metal in your possession has no counterparty risk. The specific allocation depends on your circumstances, but some allocation, in my opinion, is prudent for anyone concerned about the stability of the monetary system. Protocol. Rule 2, Diversified Jurisdiction. If you are accumulating significant precious metals holdings, consider diversifying storage jurisdiction. Holding metal in multiple countries provides protection against any single government's policies. Singapore, Switzerland, and other jurisdictions with strong property rights and precious metals infrastructure are worth considering. This is not about evading laws, it is about avoiding concentration risk. Protocol Rule 3. Consider resource exposure. BRICS expansion represents a consolidation of resource control. Nations that control oil, gas, minerals, and agricultural land gain leverage. Investments that provide exposure to these resources, whether commodity ETFs, mining stocks, or royalty companies, could benefit from the resource consolidation thesis. Protocol Rule 4. Reduce dollar concentration. If your wealth is entirely denominated in dollars, entirely held in American financial institutions, and entirely dependent on the continued stability of the dollar system, you are concentrated in a single outcome. Diversification across currencies, jurisdictions, and asset classes reduces this concentration. This does not mean abandoning the dollar entirely. It means avoiding the assumption that the dollar's current status is permanent and positioning for alternatives. Protocol Rule 5. Monitor the signals. Watch for the signals that the transition is accelerating. Major nations are announcing reduced treasury holdings, expansion of non-dollar trade settlement, announcements about BRICS currency basket implementation, increases in central bank gold accumulation. These signals, if they intensify, indicate that the timeline is compressing. They should prompt reassessment of positioning and potentially more aggressive allocation to real assets. BRICS just added more countries. Turkey, Indonesia, Algeria, and others are joining a bloc that now represents nearly half the world's population and more than a third of global GDP. This is not a symbolic expansion. This is a strategic consolidation of resources, trade routes, and economic power outside Western control. Washington is worried because the implications are profound. Treasury demand destruction as BRICS nations stop accumulating dollars. Petrodollar erosion as Saudi Arabia and other oil producers accept alternative currencies. Sanctions evasion as alternative payment systems mature. Geopolitical realignment as longtime allies hedge their bets. The dollar's reserve status rests on foundations that, in my view, are visibly cracking. The cracks are not yet critical. The building still stands. But the BRICS expansion accelerates the erosion, and the parallel financial system being constructed could, in time, render dollar hegemony a historical artifact. I am not predicting the imminent collapse of the dollar. Reserve currency transitions take time. But I am suggesting that the transition has begun, that BRICS expansion is a major milestone in that transition, and that positioning for the transition is, in my opinion, prudent. The world is choosing sides. The architecture of an alternative system is being built. The resources that back that system are being accumulated. The nations participating in that system are being recruited. This is not hypothetical. This is happening. And those who position for it before the transition becomes obvious to everyone will, in my view, be better situated than those who wait for confirmation that arrives too late. The Bretton Woods bypass is under construction. Washington is worried. Perhaps you should be paying attention too. This is AG Archivist. See you in the next one. Disclaimer. This video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing herein constitutes financial, investment, legal, or tax advice. Always conduct your own research and consult with licensed professionals before making any investment decisions. Past performance does not guarantee future results. All predictions, forecasts, and assessments represent personal opinions and not guarantees of future outcomes. Geopolitical and monetary developments are inherently unpredictable. The author may hold positions in the assets discussed.